On today's episode of Higher Learning, we went in a little bit of a different direction. We talked to organizational psychologist Abigail Phillips and talked about all things hiring, how she advises for different software organizations in the HR technology space, and what she thinks makes a good interview. Abigail has so much knowledge. I learned a ton in this episode, and I know you're going to as well. Can't wait for you to hear it.
Welcome to another episode of Higher Learning. I am your host, Oz Rashid, and today we are joined across the pond from a very special guest. We are joined by Abigail Phillips. She is an occupational psychologist, advisor, PhD. I could keep going, but I wanted to have her tell the story. Abigail, how you doing?
Yeah, great. Super happy to be here having this conversation with you today.
Very excited to have you. I appreciate you coming on. I want to dive right into it because I just think you have such an interesting background and we share a lot of the same passions. So I'm excited to kind of talk shop with you. So I know you're an IO psychologist and you have a PhD in personality psychology. You also have your own consulting company. I want to learn a little bit more about the type of work you do. What does that mean for people who are not familiar with IO psychology or this space? How would you kind of describe it to a layman or laywoman?
Yeah, I think in a nutshell, my work in IO psychology is about understanding and improving workplace dynamics and performance. So I think something that I particularly like about the field is we get to work across all levels of the organization, right? So you might be working at the company level on culture or change management or employee engagement, or maybe at the team level where you're looking at building and developing teams, or of course at the individual level, and that might look like hiring, selection, psychological assessment, coaching. Obviously, this is extremely broad. So a lot of IO psychologists will specialize in a certain area. And for me, that has been assessment and personality and individual differences. So I will look at things like leadership, team dynamics, and selection predominantly through that lens.
I love it. So I'm always interested in kind of the hero's journey in terms of your story. I mean, did you know from a very young age this is the space you wanted to get into? Like, were you going into like coffee shops and seeing that barista doesn't look very engaged? I'd like to figure out what we can do to help her develop. Or was this something that you fell into?
Yeah, definitely it's something that's evolved organically. I don't think when I was younger, I would have known that this type of work existed, to be honest. I would say I've definitely always been curious about people. I think it's probably something that unites all psychologists. Fascinated by why we do the things we do, and some people see the world so differently. But I think, and that, I suppose that led me to go and study psychology, but at undergraduate level, I think I thought I'd end up doing clinical psychology. But it was a sliding doors kind of moment and conversation with a family friend towards the end of that degree, where I learned more about organizational psychology and executive coaching. And I just remember thinking, you have those goosebump moments in life, don't you? And I just remember thinking like, this sounds like totally up my street. And haven't really looked back, I suppose, from there. But yeah, as I said, I think even when I was doing my PhD and things, I don't think I'd have thought I'd be doing what I'm doing now in terms of the way that I work with organizations and things, but I know we're going to get into that. But yeah, it's a super exciting and evolving field. And I think, to be honest, whatever industry you're in now, right, like things are exciting and evolving. So yeah, but I feel fortunate to be able to like truly say that I enjoy what I do, and I'm open to whatever kind of way that leads me.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we do here at MSH is that we typically bring in people who are from not in industry in terms of recruitment and human capital from that perspective. A lot of times, because if we bring in people who have had a lot of experience, we have to build them down to break them back up. We do things very differently here. But when we're trying to identify people, especially when they're coming out of schooling, we've actually had a lot of success hiring people with psychology degrees because particularly as technology starts to get involved and integrated into everything that we're doing from a recruitment perspective, the real value add from a human perspective is the ability to understand people's motivations, understand people's situations, be able to speak to those and understand those. And so we've always looked at that. And I've also been very passionate about psychology, took many classes in college, even though that wasn't my major. And I think it's something that really translates to what you do in this space. I also think, I don't know if you've, to go a little off tangent here, but I don't know if you've seen the show Billions. It's in it. So there is a character called Dr. Rhodes. And I remember when I first saw the show, I was fascinated because she was really high up in the organization. And she was meeting with a lot of the different people who worked at the hedge fund and was almost a therapist for them in terms of getting their best productivity. And it's funny because I have somebody in our organization who's grown through our organization, is my chief of staff, who's played a lot of that same role in terms of not just for our employees, but also for me in a lot of ways. So I think I don't know if that's something that's going to become more common, or that's something that's going to be something we're going to see as a real function within an organization. But I just find that to be interesting. Any thoughts on that? Have you seen the show? Do you know what I'm talking about? Or am I completely out of left field?
I've seen a few episodes. There's been a number of times in my career, though, where people have been like, oh, so what you do is like Wendy from Billions. And yes and no. But I think to your point about, are we going to see this more? Like, I hope so. And I hope it won't just be for, I suppose, the top, sort of 5-10% of the organization who I think, tend to be more fortunate in having access to executive level coaches and that type of support. And again, not to jump too far ahead, but I think that's where like tech and AI will help play a role in like scaling that. But yeah, it's a really good showcase, I suppose, that show of the power of this type of stuff, right?
I mean, listen, there's nothing more money involved in hedge funds. Things aren't moving. Nothing's moving faster. So it's kind of cool that they did that. So let's jump into it. I want to talk a little bit about what you do now. One of the reasons that we were connected in the first place is you do a lot of advising on HR tech companies. So I'm just interested about your work in this space. And then is there any I'm sure some things that you can't talk about, but is there any particular project you're excited about at the moment that you're working on? Give us a little bit of how you maybe got into this space and then what you might be working on that might be interesting for the listeners.
Yeah, for sure. So I talk about my work kind of falling into two camps. There's the practitioner work, which is like hands-on inside businesses, working directly on any of those areas that we described earlier, like maybe helping leaders set the culture or coaching. And then there's the product work, which isn't something I actively pursued, but is definitely something that feels like it's pursuing me. So the product work really, I suppose, is I don't like calling myself a subject matter expert necessarily, but I suppose in this domain I am. I think it's that thing where the more you know, the more you're aware of what you don't know, right? But ultimately, yeah, in the product world, it's about representing psychology, behavioral science, psychometrics, and working with tech and product teams who are building things in this space to help them quickly understand relevant research, best practice across these fields, and then figure out how to scale that quickly by kind of baking it into the product. So ultimately, those products are as effective as they can be. I think with my background, I do a lot of stuff on the assessment side. So it's definitely not confined to that area, but companies who are building assessments, and that could be for hiring, or it could be for development, or it could be for employee experience or culture. But there is a science of assessment, right? And if we're trying to measure anything, we want to make sure that we're doing that in a valid way. So there's a distinction, I suppose, if we think about psychological constructs like personality. We can't say like we can with height or weight or bank balance, right? Those are very objective things. You can go and check your bank balance now. You can go and get on a set of scales. When we're talking about resilience, emotional intelligence, cognitive ability, these are latent constructs. So there is a whole field, and this is the field of psychometrics, that's dedicated to ensuring that when we say that we're measuring extroversion, we're actually measuring extroversion, and that if you test somebody on a Monday, you're going to get the same results as if you test them on a Friday. And, I think increasingly importantly, that those are fair, that we're not discriminating against certain groups. And, in certain contexts like hiring, there is legislation around these things as well. So, not to like scare anyone, but just to say, that there is a lot to consider, and maybe a lot more than meets the eye at times. So that's one place where there would be some technical support, I suppose. But then beyond that, it's leveraging existing knowledge and best practice, like I said. So if we use the example of a hiring tool, one company that I was working with, they not only wanted to build assessments into this tool, but they also wanted to then be able to equip their users with best practice questions that they could use. So let's say we flagged up extroversion as being something that they might want to probe at the interview. Well, how do they do that in an effective way? Because there's a lot of people doing hiring and not a lot of people who've had training. So how can we, again, like bring tools and knowledge from occupational psychology and bake that into the product? So yeah, and I think
Anybody listening to this knows that this is like my life's work, and you're saying a lot of the things that I deeply, and there's so much I want to unspool there and talk about. But the good news for me is that we'll continue to have subsequent conversations. Bad news for the listeners is that we've got to stay on track for the podcast. But just know that I believe deeply everything you just talked about. I'm so interested in getting more insight from you, and I'd love to talk about it from our software perspective. So that's awesome. We will follow up on that. Let's talk about AI though, because AI is
yeah,
go
yeah.
ahead. Anything
No,
else?
I was just going to say, I think a segue into AI, I can answer the second part of your question, which I failed to answer before, which is like a project I'm working on that I think is exciting, which I think will be a really good segue into AI. So I can talk about them because I think they're out of stealth mode now in a closed beta. They're a Danish startup actually called Humany, and they have built this AI powered tool that is leveraging decades of research on psychological and behavioral science, really with the aim to help teams communicate, collaborate, and ultimately perform better. And honestly, like the results are just so impressive. I think we're coming to a place now with AI and like being able to integrate AI into what we're doing where like it doesn't feel like a stretch to be able to say that we're going to be able to truly democratize coaching, at least a certain level of coaching. And I think that's something that, you know, I've been in this industry for a long time. I know a lot of companies and individuals have been really pursuing that because it's something that we know is really effective, but is really expensive. And yeah, when I'm looking at what we're able to do now, if we design sort of with AI at the epicenter, rather than I think what other products are sort of doing, which is like, you know, if you've already built something and you're trying to bake AI in, you know, that's great and you'll be able to get some efficiencies. But I think actually designing with AI at the core offers you a bunch of like really cool advantages and ability to go faster. And I think if we think about a product like this that sits in the kind of learning and development space, really, you've got an opportunity to solve some really age-old problems. Like hyper personalizing learning is something that used to be or has always been like really expensive, really time consuming. We know that it helps make learning more engaging and more effective, but most teams just don't have the resources or the time or the money to do it. Like now we can do it super quickly. And I think the other thing is embedding learning in the flow of work, again, has always sort of been the holy grail. But it's really difficult for companies to get away from training being a one-off event, because if you imagine what would be involved in kind of creating hyper-personalized learning for everyone in your organization and being able to deliver that to them in the moment when they need it to reinforce that learning, it's crazy. But that's all possible now. And I think maybe if I give an example to try to bring that to life for you and maybe listeners, but if we think about maybe a new manager, so a lot of organizations will invest in some training for their new managers. A common thing that they would want them to learn is how to be able to give feedback well. That's something that managers need to be able to do. So maybe they send them off to a workshop with other managers in the business and other new managers, and they practice some tools, they learn some theories, they role play a few scenarios. And you know, that's great. But unfortunately, we know that it isn't particularly effective longer term. We're overwhelming people with a lot of information in a short period of time that isn't reinforced. And so actually, even up to a week later, a lot of it is forgotten. And if we contrast that with something like, you know, what the Humany product is able to do, you can think about, you've got the opportunity to be reminded of the elements of giving feedback that you most need to know right in the moment when you need it. So let's say that your calendar pops up to say you've got a feedback meeting with Josh in 10 minutes. You click into that meeting and you have those 3 things that are most pertinent for you to remember. And not only that, but that reminder is also tailored to who you are as a manager and your managerial style, and also what Josh in this scenario needs from you. So again, anyone who's experienced it at managing and leading and giving feedback will know that different people tend to need slightly different things from us in that context. That is a big ask, like generally for us as any kind of human, to hold all of that information right at any one point in time. But a lot of us, especially those who, truly are people first, want to be able to bring that experience to our teams. And so I think what's really cool here is it's like, for me, as a psychologist, but also, a citizen of the world, I want to see technology help sort of rehumanize workplaces, help us build better connections, more empathy, more like people skills, really. And I think there are some applications of this technology that I think are doing the opposite. And again, that's not to bash anyone, but I think it's just to say, like, I think we need to be particularly mindful about, and intentional, I suppose, is maybe a better word, but about how we're using this and make sure we're using it for the right end.
Yeah. I mean, there's so much I want to build off on there. So a few things I'll think about. So I'll bring up. So, right, what I would say is going on right now is that really what the technology's capability that's out there is infinite's the wrong word, but it's vast. And what we're seeing though is that application of it is what we're still learning and figuring out. Obviously, we've seen with chips that's there. I recently saw with Klarna that they replaced their contact center, right? And they're not even hiring anymore now. So everybody's going about it in a little bit of a different way. So we're starting to see some of the early kind of case studies or use cases that are working, right? But what it's going to look like and why there's a little bit of a Wild West field is that it's very hard to predict what businesses and consumers are going to move to, lean to, and how quickly they're going to do it, how quickly they're going to adopt it. So it's a very interesting time from that perspective. I believe the amount of investment that we've seen from VCs is completely dwarfing the amount of return on investment that we've actually gotten from AI. Everybody knows how important this is. Everybody's investing in it and trying to get out in front, but the actual return on investment isn't there just yet. We know that will change though. So that's one aspect. Second aspect is we started building this software like 2018, and I had to tell you that the core of it, right? I felt like AI, we were looking like 25, 26. We'd have the product out for multiple years, and then we would start to add AI components to it. And then quite the opposite happened, right? Obviously, when ChatGPT and OpenAI democratized to a degree consumer usage of AI, and now we're seeing all these different large language models out there, it's made it more accessible, and it's allowed us to actually build the tool native to AI and have AI be intrinsic into it. And what people don't get is that AI is not something that you sell. It's the components that make what you build amazing. And I think what's really important to understand from that perspective is we all have access to a lot of the things that AI does. And so where we have to be very clear as an organization, and specifically what I think a lot about is where does the innovation of AI and the large language models stop? And where does the innovation of our product begin and the moats that we have around that? And that's what's really incumbent on any software company out there right now. So that really love that. I love that you spend a lot of time in this space. And then the last thing I would say is I am 100% aligned with you around enabling technology, right? Technology enabling the human-centered experience. One of the things that drives me nuts is when I see people building software in this space, people who haven't been doing what I've done for the last 13 years, tens of thousands of hires across 43 countries, hundreds of companies, big and small, learning these things. Everybody wants to make, they think like they want to automate it. Like it's like a truck driving you like down the road and you can automate that, or all these other things that we automate, when this is really a very complex and very nuanced thing. It's absolutely human centered. And like one of the things that drives me nuts that I've seen is there's this advertisement that's going on right now where this guy's built this software which builds an AI avatar of me, and now you're interviewing with Oz, but you're not interviewing with Oz. And I just loathe this. This is tech people building tech that they think people want, but that actually doesn't solve the real problem. And at the end of the day, I don't know about you, if I was interviewing to come work at my company and you were talking to a avatar of me rather than the real me, no matter how realistic that sounds or how much it actually operated like I would operate, we're not building a rapport. You have no idea who you're coming to work with. And that's such a big part of interviewing. And it just drives me nuts. Any thoughts on that? Am I hitting the nail on the target in terms of how you look at it?
Yeah, 100%. I think, I talk about one of the reasons I got involved with Humany, and I'm passionate about Humany as being because I see it as helping to rehumanize. And what you just described is a perfect example of tech being used to dehumanize. I'm with you. Like, I think this is where like we can underestimate the importance of connection and human connection in every kind of phase of life. But I think interviewing is no exception. And that's actually normally the time in the hiring process, right, where maybe you have done some assessments, or, you've at least written a cover letter or submitted your CV, and this is your time to meet somebody. And by the way, like that's a two-way assessment. Like that's what I'm always encouraging everyone anyway. Like it's not just them assessing you. Like I want to have the opportunity to figure out for myself if I want to come and work at this company. So if that's just being outsourced to an AI avatar, what does that tell me as a candidate about how important this is to you? So I think, yeah, you got to think.
Preach. Our mutual friend Amelia and told me on my podcast, and I really love this, that when they interview people for her company, it's a 50-50 game. They're interviewing 50%, of course, but also they're setting it up so that the candidate is interviewing them. And I think that is absolutely the way to look at it. And that's why that experience is so important. It's not just about, I want to hire this person, because that's how offers get turned down. That's how you hire bad fits. That's how you make all different types of mistakes in this space. And for me, there's a bottom line impact that's critical to making mistakes in this space. And quite frankly, it hasn't evolved, but I think that it's going to hockey stick evolve very soon, and we're going to get more certainty and better experience all in one. And I hope to, and I know you're part of that revolution, and I want to be part of that revolution too. What I want to do is we're going to move on to the hiring portion, because we do this with everybody we talk to, but we're going to take a little bit of a different approach with you. You've done a ton of hiring throughout your career. I'm going to ask you some things around that, but I'm interested in you kind of advising some of the people that listen, because they care about hiring deeply, around some of the best practices. So I want to start here. You're passionate about hiring. We already know that based on some of the things you said. We know that based on some of the things that you and I have talked about in the past. I'm interested in why this has been a space you have specialized in and why you think it's so important.
It's cliche because it's true, I think, in this case, right? Like people make or break your business. So everything comes back to people. I was looking at as an example, right, of where I sit on this, like I was looking at just last week, it was a CB Insights report on why startups fail. And it had this catalog of reasons, and you'll have seen them before. You know, they ran out of money, they didn't get product market fit, they had a flawed business model. And I was looking at this and I was thinking, like, yeah, but actually, that's not the root cause. Like, the root cause, if you dig deeper, is ultimately people and the decisions that they've made. And again, this isn't me trying to say, like, oh, you know, if you've had a business and it hasn't worked out, like, this is all your fault. Of course, things can happen. But ultimately, with proper people due diligence, like, we can actually predict and help identify, like, if you give me a founder, I'll tell you which of these categories they're most likely to be at risk of and what we can do to prevent that. So if we take the example of, you know, running out of cash, if you've got a founder who's got a really high risk appetite, they are more likely to make aggressive financial gambles. They may pay off, but they may not. And if you couple that with a sort of like poor attention to detail, a lack of financial management skills and experience, particularly with if you take like a VC-backed founder who's all of a sudden got millions in the bank, you know, like you start to piece all these things together, they are much more at risk of that particular failure pattern than somebody who's got a really low risk appetite, a high attention to detail, and maybe a background in finance and accounting or whatever.
I gotta say,
think,
yeah, go ahead. It's like, are you my British female twin? Like, this is incredible. One thing that I've been saying for many years in our company, and this is what I just don't get. This is why, this is my life's work, because I don't feel like people look at it as important as it is and put the resources and time and attention that they should. And one of the things is exactly what you're saying, it a little bit more from like the individual founder level. I'm going to take it to a different degree, right? I've said all the time that when you look at a great marketing plan or some amazing technology or this world-class sales model that's been built, when I look at these companies, right, and they have these things that have driven their success, ultimately, in my mind, American Express is not a financial services company. It's a people company. John Deere is not a tractor company. It's a people company. And what I mean by that is those sales models, that marketing content technology was built by people. Sometimes we're looking at the output and realizing, so when these startups fail, to your point, there's all these reasons that they give, but ultimately they all line up with either the founder and his mentality, his or her mentality, or the people that they hire that weren't able, like we all know that life or death in a startup is that first hire, then the 10th hire, then the 100th hire. Your ability to scale is amazingly tied to that. And exactly why I like working in that space, because they get it. The right founders get that. And they know that I have to have the right talent and there's a limit to my network. And so being able to help identify that great talent and fit into our company is huge. So anyway, I went on a little bit of a rant, but you're getting me excited with some of the things you're talking about. So I didn't mean to cut you off. Go ahead.
No, you didn't at all. That's where I was going. Like, of course it applies to roles. Like it applies everywhere. And I think, you know, if you take leaders, especially senior leaders, they may have even like proven that they can do the job, but then you put them in this context of a leadership role, which is really like a different role from the role that they've been doing before. And all of a sudden the stakes become not just your performance, but the performance of a team and actually the well-being and the culture of a team and company. And we all have potential derailers, right? We are like all flawed, fallible people. And I think somehow, somewhere along the way, there's become a little bit of stigma maybe around like really truly admitting and leaning into like what our risk factors are. But I would say actually, and where I'm trying to position and do more of my work now as well is like, actually, let's lean into and own that, and then say like, okay, to the company like who wants to invest in you as a person, whether that's your development or bringing you in, like what do they need to know to set you up for success? Like if you're going to be in this role, here's all the great things that you're bringing, here are the things that we need to watch out for. And so then what does that look like? And it's the same with the founder example. It's like de-risk the investment. I'm not saying like, oh, let's not invest in anyone who's got a high risk appetite, like because sometimes often that can pay off. But it's about saying like, who is this person? What is the context that they're operating in? And so then like, what can we do to de-risk that? And I think that's where, personality psychology and things has got a lot to offer. And that's a lot of the work that I'm super interested in as well.
I love that. And one of the things I would say is if I'm looking at a founder, if I'm a VC and I'm investing in somebody that has that, like you said, there's tremendous upside on that. Usually those are the people that end up being the Elon Musks
Yeah, for sure.
of the world, right? But who's the people around them that are maybe, a little bit on the disc profile? They might be more on the compliance side or the MBTI, you know what I mean? Like you want to building those teams of getting effective counter thoughts that person respects and will listen to too, I think is a big solve for that. I'm interested what you think companies often get wrong when it comes to hiring. What are some like long held, standards or beliefs that people do that you just think got to get rid of this?
Yeah. So I would say the biggest mistake that I see companies making, and look, I understand where this comes from because we're all time poor, but it's like failing to put the work in to actually truly identify what you need before you start hiring. And I think I've seen this, like this leads to, wish lists of things that are like too long and they're not feasible. And I think if you think about, like even if you tell me you want 3 things in a person, like, oh, Abby, I only want 3 things. I just want them to be like a great team player. I want them to be really intelligent and really high attention to detail. That's all I want, but they really need to be like really good on all those 3 things. And we can take your applicant pool then and we can say like, okay, let's take the top 10%. They've got to be really intelligent. So the top 10% of intelligence. Then, they've got to have really high attention to detail. So the top 10% of that, 10%, 10%, we're at 1%. And we've only put 2 things in your ingredients bucket, right? So if you're not super clear at the beginning about what you want and why you want it, like I would challenge, like, do they really need to be super, super intelligent or do they need to be intelligent enough? Like, and so I think that's one thing that I often see companies getting wrong, but I think failing to do the work up front means you're not in a position to really understand that. And I think there's knock-on effects then for, the hiring process and the interviews and everything. And I think the other
May I expound on that real quickly?
Yeah, go for it.
I just, if you would have asked me the same question, I think I would have said exactly the same thing. And here's why. Our company was founded back in 2011, and we put a methodology together, which wasn't happening in recruitment as much at that time, right? It was more of a consulting thing. And one of the first level, and what I consider the most important level, is intake. And where we really differentiated that. So what this would be, we would get an opportunity. It might be a VP of supply chain. It might be a physician. It might be a technology leader, whatever it may be. But I was a project manager. So for me, the most important thing, if I wanted to be successful for a project, was understanding the requirements up front. And to your point, where people get it wrong is both ways. Either they're too light, right? Or they're too heavy. They're not really focusing on what's truly important. And so what these intake sessions became was not how much compensation are you paying? Are you willing to relocate, which is some of the standard tactical stuff that you hear out there in a lot of these conversations. It was more of a therapy session where we're talking, it'd be a 30-minute conversation where we're understanding that hiring manager, because really it comes down to preferences. It comes down to current team composition. It comes down to expectations. And so we would be asking way more intuitive questions like, how do you define success for this person in 180 days? What are your gaps on your team that you think that this person could help fill from a personality, behavioral perspective, right? Why was this person in the role previously promoted or let go? And how can we mitigate that? Finding that and now getting those inputs and then creating questions around those outputs can give you some level of certainty and percentage of fit for that person. Now, the key is a lot of times hiring managers don't know themselves what are the key factors that ultimately lead to success. And only if you sit down and have that session and really understand can you be successful. So we've been doing that from a services perspective, and we're building that into our technology as well. So I totally agree with you. What's the second one you're thinking?
Yeah, I think just on that, it's like if as an organization you don't have something in place to help guide hiring managers through that process, try and build something, because it will pay dividends. I'm so confident of that. The second thing, and I think this might be like potentially unpopular opinion alert, but like it is a flawed perception that talent is a universal concept. Like it's not. Talent is highly context dependent, and it's why so many really good individual contributors fail when, well, not fail, but like maybe start underperforming it when they like end up as managers. And it's why like high ups from corporates often don't work out in like scrappy startups. And it's why a toxic manager can like derail the performance of an entire team. So I think this assumption that like, oh, they were the best engineer there, let's just bring them in and it'll all work out and let's just focus on getting them in through the door, is like really flawed logic. And I think again it sort of reinforces my point before, but I think the task of anyone when hiring is to figure out like what's it going to take for somebody to be successful here. Let's find somebody who fits that profile, and then let's actually set them up for success once they're in the door. And it does take more time, and it is more effort up front, but you will save yourself a lot of headache. And I think most of us have experienced the pain of sort of failed hires, right? So hopefully that's a bit of an incentive. But yeah, I think that's.
I'm gonna sound like I'm glomming off of everything you say, but I gotta agree with you again. I talk about to people about this all the time. Really, what it comes down to is fit more so than anything. Time, fit. Are you setting that person up for success? I do think that there is like a very, very finite group of people that you can drop them in situations, and over the course of time, they are going to adapt. They are going to learn and figure out how to be successful. But I think that the vast majority of people that are successful are context dependent in terms of the management, the team, the challenge, the training, the things like that. And do they have the right kind of raw ability, skills, behaviors that you can put into your machine and get the max out of them? And so I've used like NFL analogies in the past because you're British. I'll go EPL. Mo Salah, played for Chelsea at some point, right? And he didn't have any success. They sold him off to a team in Roma, and then eventually he came to Liverpool, and he was under Klopp, and they built a circumstance organization, and maybe he was at a different point of his life where he became one of the best players in the league. And so, but who knows? You don't know that if he went to, say, Arsenal or Man United, the same thing happens, because there was certain things that happened there that was a cauldron that made him what he was. And so individual talent, right, is great, but if you put him in the wrong context, you're not going to max it out. You're not going to get what you want out of it. And so I totally agree with you on that. And that, like I said, let's use a dating analogy too, right? Great guy, but that doesn't mean I'm a great right for every person out there, right? My wife fits, it works, right? So it's a match thing. So like you said, it's not about that independent talent. It's about how they fit in with what they're doing, and that's how you get best results. So I'm totally with you on that. What advice do you have for listeners about how to conduct a great interview? Do you have favorite questions you like to ask, maybe?
I think that, building on what we said before, it's like ask relevant questions. Once you've done that work to identify what you're looking for, it's actually quite easy then to work backwards to say like, okay, what do I need to ask and find out about this individual to give me the insights that I need to know to make this decision. I think, like anyone who's asking like old school Google brain teaser questions, like Maltesers in a mini, like just don't, like, please don't, even they don't. I think another thing that I think with interviews is, and I see this a lot, and I'll say it, I'll just own it. Like I see it a lot with senior people. So I think I always say like, try and give candidates the opportunity to show you their potential rather than looking for ways to try and trip them up. So I think a lot of there is a temptation, right, to approach interviews as like a stress test. And it's almost like we can see the interview as like, oh, this person is like trying to trick me and to give them a job and think that, they're good. And my job is to almost like really probe and prove that they're not. And again, unless like you're really trying to understand somebody's ability to tolerate a highly stressful, awkward, uncomfortable situation, just don't approach it like that. Like, use the interview as an opportunity to give everybody the chance to show you what they're capable of. If you've got an effective screening and filtering process, then you should trust by the time you're talking to a candidate, they're a relatively good fit. And you can, rather than sort of like leveling the playing field by saying who can deal with the most uncomfortable, stressful interview possible, we can say like who, if we level the playing field and say like who's got the best chance to show us what they're capable of and capable of delivering, I think that just tends to lead to better results, because like oftentimes the people that excel in those stress test interviews are not actually the people that will necessarily excel in the role. Yeah. And I think be aware of bias. As a psychologist, you know, I think I want to say that I think there's, again, like we spoke about like some stigma around like weaknesses and things before. There's definitely a lot of stigma around this, like, and there shouldn't be, because we all have it. Like, it's a natural consequence of the sheer volume of information that we're exposed to and have to process every single second. And I think there are some great tools and resources out there. Like, people are probably aware of Harvard's Project Implicit and things. Like, you can go, you can take a quick test, you can understand, start to learn a bit more about your bias. And that is the first step to mitigating it and minimizing it. Something that I always cover, like when I do interviewer training, is look for disproving data. So, you know, we'll tend to decide, like, we all have like instant reactions to people, right? Like, we'll warm to somebody or we won't, or, you know, maybe somebody's been at a company that we're really impressed by, and
Confirmation bias, confirmation bias,
yeah, all of this stuff.
Yeah.
So we make that decision, but I think if you, and I say, you know, like, be honest with yourself about that. Like, okay, you like this person, but then spend the interview actively looking for disproving data, because that will help you mitigate that confirmation bias that you have. So there's a bunch of things that you can do, and I think it is your responsibility to do. And I think we only have to look at, you know, like how biased these AI hiring models are to know how biased we've been in our decision making so far. And again, it's not to bash anyone. It's just to say, like, you know, knowledge is power. Like, if you're interviewing anyone, you know, I think that's a really important thing to be aware of. I think in terms of questions, this isn't mine, so, and I can't remember whose it is, but I don't want to take credit, but I can't tell you. But there is a model, it's like an acronym called Raw Talent, and it's really useful. I always think I want to make sure that I've got questions that cover all of these areas. So the R is rewarding. You want to make sure that you've got somebody who is rewarding to work with. This is the whole Netflix brilliant jerk thing. There is no single person that you can bring onto your team that will be worth like a net negative impact, right? So you want to be bringing people in who are going to be a positive contribution to the culture and the team. Even if that is in a relatively isolated individual contributor role, you still want to make sure that that cultural alignment or culture add piece is going to be there. The ability is the A of the raw, and that's the piece that we all tend to be like pretty tuned in with. Like, we want to make sure that we're confident they can do the job. The last piece, the W, is willing. So willing to do the job. This is about their motivation. And, you know, I always say performance is ability times motivation. And I think most of us who've been working for a decent amount of time, and certainly people who have like led and managed teams, will know this to be true. You really need to feel confident that the person is motivated to do this job in this environment and is there for the right reasons. And people can play a relatively good game here, I suppose, but it's an area that I like to spend quite a lot of time probing, because I think actually you can tend to correct for a slight dip in ability much easier than you can a dip in motivation. So if somebody like isn't really there for the right reasons, that it will be a much harder slog for a much longer time, and you'll probably lose them a lot quicker than somebody who really wants to be there and maybe has a little bit more to learn. So a question that I do like that taps into that is, tell me about the best and worst job that you ever had. And then you probe. Like, what was it that made one experience great? Was it the people, the accomplishments, the culture? What was it about the culture that particularly worked for them? Was it the travel? And, on the other side, like, what made it particularly poor? Was it the lack of autonomy? Was it a bad boss? And if so, what was it about the boss that made them bad in this person's opinion? I think that gives you a view on the motivation from the sort of cultural piece, because look, every company has different cards to play, right, when it comes to culture. And it isn't possible in every industry or every role or every company for everyone to have a lot of flexibility or a lot of autonomy. Some companies, those are their trump cards, and you want to attract people that's a real motivator for them, that's important to them. So I think there's something just to be said on alignment there. And of course, there'll be additional questions that you'll want to look at in the role and the progression of the role as well.
I think that's fantastic. I'm actually probably going to use that. I really, really like it. A lot of the things you're talking about, I got to be honest, it's like I feel like some of my secret sauce is our algorithms and
Oh
the way
no.
companies coming out. But no, this is good stuff. It's going to really help people. It's so informational. I'm going to ask you two more things around hiring quickly. If I asked you to think about a memorable interview that either you like saw, heard about, you don't got to name names. It could be bad, it could be good, but like, do you have like, I imagine you've seen some crazy things out there. So I'm just interested. Do you have any, if I asked you, does any story come to mind?
I'll put you on the spot. I know she's listening, so give me a second and I'll think. I'm conscious that I don't want to dig anyone out.
I don't want to, you don't have to name any names. I saw somebody say this in an interview. I saw somebody show up like this. I saw somebody blow it with the perfect person. Anything like that?
Oh, well, I've obviously seen a lot of that. I mean, I think, look, my response to that would be aligned to what I spoke about before on this whole stress testing. I've seen a lot of that, and I've had a lot of debriefs from candidates around that, where, they're going into an interview with the CEO, and the CEO is basically acts like this interview is a waste of their time, really. Their body language is off. It's very much like, you impress me, you tell me why we should be here. Oh, but doesn't this on your CV or career history undermine that, what you've just said? Oh, what will this person say when I ring them up and ask them about this? Like, does your current boss know that you're here? Oh, well, then in 3 months' time, will you be interviewing for other jobs and I won't know? Just like really
Obtuse, lacking self-awareness, making it about.
And I think there's a little bit of arrogance, I think, that comes with that. And I just think, look, if you're interviewing like that, even if you find people, they're probably not going to be people who really want to be there and support your mission. I think you're representing, your company, and good people have options in a nutshell.
That's talent has options. You got to make sure that you, again, like you're creating that attracts people. All right. Last hiring question. All right. So people are listening to this and they're like, my God, Abigail is like a hiring genius. She's got it all set. She's giving us great advice, but I'm interested in this. I imagine at points in your career, you've missed on people you've hired. And I'm wondering any biases that maybe you saw in yourself, maybe early in your career, maybe even now that you still have to fight against, like when you miss on somebody, typically what would have happened?
So yeah, I think I've tried to course correct for that in a way. So I think look, like a lot of us, I think we all have a tendency to hire in our image. I think that is definitely something that until you've learned or experienced differently, it's like that feels safe. So I would have a tendency to want to work with people that have got a similar background, that I just know that we've got that shared knowledge base and things like that. And I think the other thing is, that rapport, like it is so important, and it can, and it does impact our view of people. So there's a bunch of things that I've tried to put in place to sort of kind of course correct that. And actually one of them is, I would do a sort of work sample a little bit earlier in the hiring process than maybe I would have done before. So actually, before I spend a load of time with somebody, as part of that sort of interview connect, I would, invite them to think about something or bring something to the table, because I think putting people on the spot or riffing in the interview doesn't always act, that can actually, I think, eliminate people who with a little bit more time and space can come up with incredible ideas. And so I think the way that I maybe approach things in the past did a disservice to people who just work in a slightly different way to me, or approach problems in a different way. And I think, like many of us, once you have more experience and you actually realize, God, the complementary things are actually, 10x working with people in your image. So yeah, it's definitely something I try to be aware of now. But I think, it's all the normal things. It's like, make sure it's not just your opinion, use multiple different assessments as part of the hiring process. Don't just rely on an interview or an assessment or whatever. Yeah.
Good. I love that. And it's nice to reflect and look back on that. I can think about some of the things that when I've gotten it wrong, a lot of times it's because I hadn't fully shaped the role in my head, or maybe I hired the person that would work for the role today, but not what it would be tomorrow. I've seen situations where it was like really killing me that the role was open. And so I started to rationalize people that may or may not have been the greatest fits. And to your point, sometimes people I liked, or sometimes people that had commonalities with me, I probably over-indexed a little bit in terms of what they could actually bring to the table. And sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't. So I love it. Great, great feedback. All right. Last two questions.
Okay.
We've talked a lot about hiring. This has been a wealth of knowledge for everybody listening. What do you do for fun?
Oh, what do I do for fun? I like doing yoga. I swim a lot. I have a dog who I like to walk. Although, honestly, British weather, I know I'm like totally playing into the cliche that we always talk about weather as well, but it's June and it's freezing and it's raining. So,
What kind of dog do you have?
he's a little Shih Tzu Chihuahua cross, tiny little lap dog.
No cussing on this podcast. We have, oh shit, got you. I got you. That's amazing. How long have you had the dog?
He's 9.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yep. I had a dog for 14 years. He passed last year. And then we have another little miniature golden doodle, which honestly sometimes is very cute and sometimes is very like yipping and annoying. So we'll leave that alone. Shout out to Rocco. Last question. I'd love to know one bit of career advice that maybe you'd have offered yourself early on in your career, or maybe for any early in career talent who's listening, that you didn't know then, but that you know now.
Yeah, a lot of things. I think the core thing would be come up with your own definition of success and work towards that rather than someone else's. Definitely a lesson that I think I learned the hard way, but I see a lot of people learning the hard way. I think taking the time, especially if you are earlier in your career, to figure out what your work values are. Like we've spoken about some of these things around culture, but like it's fine if what you want is like prestige or money, but it's also okay if freedom and balance are more important to you, or variety is something that's really important to me. And like also some people are really motivated by doing work that's in service of others. So there's not a right or wrong per se, but there is a right and wrong for each of us. And I think society tends to sort of kind of put slightly more weight on certain things than others in how they describe success. And, in my professional life, I've worked with far too many people who, on paper have achieved incredible success, but don't feel particularly proud or fulfilled at all, because when you dig into it with them, like by their own definition of success, they haven't actually achieved much at all. They're living somebody else's dream. And, I think my field has a lot to offer in this space. And it's something that I am actually particularly passionate about, particularly with young people, because I think in the UK, our school and education system doesn't really do enough to encourage people to really find a career that's right for them. It's more about, do this because you'll earn lots of money, or it's socially acceptable, or whatever. I don't know. So yeah,
that motivation, right? We sometimes put ourselves. So it's good. I like that. Yeah. Abigail, listen, I really appreciate you coming on. I mean, I got to tell you, if our listeners didn't learn anything about hiring listening to this, then we got no hope for you. I don't know what to do. You were incredible. So many great insights. I really appreciate you spending all the time with us. Thanks for coming on.
No problem at all. Thank you for having me.
All right. I'll talk to you later.